Okay, thank you everyone, and good afternoon, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We hope you had a good lunch and enjoyed the first session with the keynote and session one. I'm Kristina Fong, lead economic researcher at the ASEAN Studies Center at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, and I'll be your moderator for the coming session. Now, shifting gears a little bit to take a more economic perspective on things. I think when we look at the first session in particular, I think it's safe to say that we're still in an economy or a global landscape of much flux. There's still a lot of global uncertainties and volatility in the landscape. And I think given this situation, it's often easy for us to be inundated with this information and all the clear and present dangers, and we may miss actually planning for or strategizing for the longer term in the future. And that, of course, is a danger for a lot of countries. And I think this actually forms the basis of the panel today. How can these uncertainties really form a catalyst, I guess, to have countries really think about and strategizing for the more medium term through structural enhancements and other drivers? And as you can see, this panel is very diverse today. We're looking at it from different aspects, from the business environment to financial infrastructure, sustainability initiatives, and also the innovation ecosystem. But all these aspects kind of come together as cogs of the same wheel that can really drive sustainable regional economic resilience. And I know we'd love to really jump into the meat of things at the moment, but if I may take a few moments to introduce our esteemed panel. First up today in the order of presentations, we have Tan Sri Mohamed Nazir Tun Abdul Razak, Chairman of the ASEAN Business Advisory Council of Malaysia. He's also the Chairman and founding partner of ISEAS Capital, and of course, well known for steering the CIMB Group through much success up until his retirement from CIMB in 2018. I think, Tan Sri, you have first-hand experience of building an ASEAN brand and company, so we'd be very honored to hear your insights on this later on. Next up, we have Mr. Kian Heng, Group Head and Lead Economist at the ASEAN +3 Macroeconomic Research Office. He also joins us today, and he's previously Head of Corporate Investment at UOB in Singapore, and he's had stints at OCBC as well as the Monetary Authority of Singapore. He brings a wealth of experience in financial developments across the region, as well as the digital aspect, which we will touch on in the coming presentation. Next up, we take a shift to sustainability, which is an area that the UNDP has done a lot of good work in. We're honored to have Mr. Vrkić, resident representative to Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei, on the panel as well today. And Mr. Vrkić was the strategic advisor to the UNDP's Bureau for Asia and the Pacific before his current posting. And prior to that, UNDP's deputy resident representative to Papua New Guinea. Excited to get your global perspectives on things. And finally, to nicely round up the panel, we have Dr. Marco Kamiya, the UNIDO resident representative for Indonesia, Timor-Leste, and the Philippines. Very exciting news over the weekend with the formal accession of Timor-Leste into ASEAN. Dr. Kamiya is also very active in the global arena as a senior member of the United Nations Economist Network in New York, fellow at the Cambridge Industrial Innovation Policy in the UK, and has worked in Asia, Africa, as well as Latin America. And most notably, he is an associate senior fellow at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. Thank you all for joining us today. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Tan Sri Nazir to start off the discussion today on how we can steer the private sector through choppy waters that we're facing at the moment. Tan Sri, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kristina, and good afternoon. And of course, thank you so much for having me back here at ISEAS. And thank you for the opportunity to listen to this morning's proceeding, and in particular, our Deputy Minister's thought-provoking keynote address. He essentially, if you recall, talked about his triple middle priorities, and also the need to explore strengthening of the ASEAN Secretariat and greater regionalism in general going into this new order. And I would absolutely agree with Chin Tong, and in fact would like to reinforce his call from the perspective of the private sector. Now, just to repeat what Kristina mentioned, my vantage point is 20 years of regionalizing CIMB, growing CIMB from a local Malaysian bank to one that that covered the entire ASEAN region. Then I spent 5 years building a new private equity firm which invests across the ASEAN region. And I've also spent 3 years as chair of the ASEAN and the ABAC Malaysia private sector body. And this last year, I've chaired the ASEAN Business Advisory Council. Of course, this year, 2025, use Chin Tong's words, is the year the world changed. And from a private sector perspective, it's been tumultuous. So this year, this time of transition, I think my big point is that, comes from this, my favorite quote from Game of Thrones, which is that chaos is a ladder. And I think it's a very, very challenging time for ASEAN businesses, but it's also an opportunity to leapfrog. And that opportunity to leapfrog is also double-sided in the sense that you could also be leapfrogged. So one has to make the right moves. All the actors in ASEAN, the companies, the states, as well as the regional organizations, we have to take this opportunity to leapfrog, in my view. And, I am a big believer in ASEAN, the advantages of regionalism, as well as from a business standpoint, the economies of scale of a regional business. And, of course, we all know what ASEAN has done in terms of underwriting peace and stability and free trade agreements, as well as the ASEAN Charter of 2007 and so on. But in my view, economically, from an economic integration standpoint, ASEAN has fallen way short. In 2007, they promised us the ASEAN Economic Community by 2015. In 2015, the economic community looked nothing like the single production base, free movement of skilled labor, capital, and investments that they promised. So ASEAN did not deliver the AEC. And if you look at tariffs, yes, 99% of goods have almost zero tariffs, but there's almost a perfect correlation between the decline in tariffs and the rise in non-tariff measures. And if you look at the regional frameworks that came during this period, also a lot were found wanting. The classic is in banking, where they came up with the Qualified ASEAN Banking Framework. And guess what? At the heart of the Qualified ASEAN Banking Framework, a multilateral framework, is that countries in ASEAN should negotiate with each other. I mean, that sums it up, right? We have a regional arrangement which encourages you, or rather leaves you, to just negotiate bilaterally. And if you look at the data in terms of intra-regional trade, it's still hovering at low 20s. If you look at investments also, intra-ASEAN investments also is about late teens, and it's been kind of hovering there. And when I market ASEAN to the rest of the world, and I've gone around the world this year as the marketing ASEAN, most investors say, yeah, you tell me about this market of 700 million people and high growth and young population, all very well. But when I come there, it's 10 fragmented economies. And it's very difficult for me to do business. So I really believe that ASEAN can do more together without jeopardizing the important stuff that holds it together. Now, people always worry that the ASEAN way has got us here, so why do we want to change it, and so on and so forth. I think that's too defeatist. I think, if we look at this new world order, we need to ask whether, ASEAN in the way it does things now, can position ASEAN optimally in this new world order, right? I think my answer is it can't. I think there's so much more we can do together. And of course, every step we take, we need to be very careful. Is it going to jeopardize, the important things that keep us together? But we mustn't have that attitude that, let's not touch anything because the whole thing will fall apart. Yeah. And I personally, I don't spend a lot of time on the big plans when they talk about ASEAN 2045 economic communities. I don't really pay so much attention because, frankly, if you've worked in ASEAN for a long time, you get quite tired of the rhetoric. A lot of big statements, but what are the details? Yeah, what are the details of the initiatives? What exactly is being implemented? So, let me just say that I think it's time. I follow on from what Chin Tong said. We do need to reform the ASEAN institutions. The funding of the ASEAN Secretariat is paltry. We need to relook at it, whatever the formula may be. I completely agree the richer countries of ASEAN should fund more of ASEAN. ASEAN can definitely do a lot more. We need to look at the model of ASEAN. If ASEAN were a company, it would be completely dysfunctional. ASEAN has a CEO with a 5-year term and a chairman with a 1-year term, but all the power is with the chairman. Yeah, if you were a company, you'd be completely dysfunctional. Yeah. So now, as Malaysia, the leadership transitions to Philippines, we're not sure if the projects that Malaysia championed and all that will be carried on by the Philippines. Those of you in corporate setting know that new chairmen always like new projects. Yeah. So the old projects that don't finish in 12 months, they will be left aside. And I know this from the ASEAN Business Advisory Council. In fact, I chose projects of the ASEAN Business Council knowing that I only had 12 months. Otherwise, the projects will die. And so if you run an organization and you only have 12 months to do your projects, you're actually going to pick the wrong projects. Yeah. So we've got to look at this structure. And in terms of empowerment, you look at the non-tariff measures. Who's enforcing? Nobody, right? Nobody is actually saying, no, look, this is against the your FTA and please bring this measure down. Nobody's enforcing. There is this thing called the ASEAN Assist. And I think it's been around for 6 years where you can go online and complain about some non-tariff measure. I think one company has complained in 5 years. So that's how effective. The company's probably been shut down. But, it doesn't work. Yeah, and I'm also worried that ASEAN Secretariat itself doesn't see itself as a problem. At the ASEAN Business and Investment Summit, some of you will have been there, Rachel was there. We started off talking about the need to do more and the, ASEAN, intra-ASEAN trade is only 22% and so on. And then the ASEAN Deputy Secgen came up and defended the fact that it's 20%. Yeah, I think that's if ASEAN Secretary actually thinks that such a thing that is okay, then that's a bit of a problem. Yeah. And we at the ASEAN Business Advisory Council also agree that as part of this need to strengthen ASEAN, we at the ASEAN Business Advisory Council realize that we are weak. So I did an offsite. We brainstormed and said, look, guys, we got a problem. We are the Apex Business Council for ASEAN leaders, but we are weak. We're wrongly constituted. Most of you are here because it's an opportunity for you to hang out with your own leaders and not really to do work. And so, I have actually, followed through and tried to reform ASEAN Business Advisory Council as well. Then in terms of this year of trying to get things done, I honestly have to say that I'm not sure how committed all ASEAN governments are to ASEAN economic integration. I think they all look at every idea and want to see whether it's good for them. Now, Chin Tong mentioned this whole idea of an ASEAN business entity. Now, let me take this opportunity to explain to you what I mean. We said just now that ASEAN ASEAN did not deliver on the AEC, single production-based free movement of people, and we know now today that it cannot be done politically. But at the same time, we want this market of 700 million people. So how do we square the circle? We say that you can have those flexibilities at the company level. So that's why we propose this thing called an ABE, so that at the company level, you can have free movement of people. So if Malaysia says Standard Chartered, you are an ABE, then you, Standard Chartered Malaysia, can move people in and out of Malaysia freely. So on the operational side, companies can operate freely. Now, I presented this to the IMF. The MD of the IMF said this is a great idea. IMF will do a full study and wants to encourage this to be implemented in other regions across the world. When I presented it at the Indo-Pacific Summit, Nicholas Moore, who's a very experienced business guy, and said, look, we should do this even at the Indo-Pacific level. But in ASEAN, when I presented it, so far only Malaysia has chosen to adopt it. Yeah, the rest of ASEAN all went silent. Right? And it's a very simple idea. Secondly, I propose an ASEAN IPO prospectus, where if you want to list on the SGX, you can choose whether to have an ASEAN prospectus or a Singapore prospectus or an ASEAN prospectus, where you can raise money from across ASEAN. Simple idea. So the response from Singapore was, it's a great idea. Malaysia and Singapore can do it tomorrow. But Singapore would like to bundle it with a global depository receipt. Well, that annoyed me, because to me, if you really want ASEAN to progress, why do you bundle things? If something is good, just do. Don't take the opportunity to try and bundle other things, so that, then things don't get done. Yeah. So, and the list can go on. There are many, many things we can do more with ASEAN. We could talk about the development of the ASEAN bond market with ASEAN rating agencies. I've done a study on the ASEAN private markets. Today, ASEAN private markets is 0.5% of GDP, when the right benchmark is 1.5% of GDP. There's about 60 billion US dollars short in capital in private markets, and therefore funding our SMEs and young entrepreneurs, etc. There's a shortage there. And the report has come up with very specific recommendations how countries can actually reform their own internal systems to ramp up ASEAN private markets. Again, the response is very lackluster, right? Then you could look at, and the other point I'd like to make is reforming ASEAN has to be multidimensional. If you want to be in one ASEAN economy, don't just look at the business and economics things. It has to be about ASEAN identity. We actually took the trouble. We went to see the ASEAN, the SEA Games Council, and said, please rebrand SEA Games to the ASEAN Games. Because we want to keep using the name ASEAN. We have a report on ASEAN CSR, looking at across the region, looking at every country, how to improve flow of CSR across border. When I was running CIMB, I realized that we made all the money in Malaysia. We opened business in Cambodia and Laos, but the Malaysian rules and regulations wouldn't let me donate to Cambodia and Laos. Yeah, so if we're really one region, we want to build businesses, you must let businesses flow philanthropy as well, so that ASEAN becomes that bit more inclusive. So there's all these things we can do. My argument is, for some reason, ASEAN just doesn't move, and I can't figure it out. And I think from the regional platforms also, it's quite frustrating, because I find that ASEAN sugarcoats everything. Yeah, I've been in ASEAN meetings where I present something, everyone says yes, yes, yes. I walk out the room, later on I found out nobody actually agreed with me. But everyone said yes. Yeah. So this kind of honesty, transparency, and ability to say it the way it is, we need to have this, because otherwise, we're not going to be able to, deal or reform the right way. And so let me wrap up before Kristina scolds me. The conclusion is that in this, if we're really going to get things done, business as usual won't do. I think we need to put these ideas on the table, look at even reforming ASEAN, so that we really have a great chance of taking advantage of the current chaos. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tan Sri. Thanks for your very candid thoughts on this. It's always a breath of fresh air to really, hear it from the ground up. Because I think many times when we have these grand frameworks, these big plans, we really forget whether they actually translate to anything credible and tangible on the ground. So it's really great to get your insights on this. Very important. And I think, you've mentioned a lot of good points actually, and I might have missed some, so please excuse that. But I mean, the balancing act that you mentioned about doing something or doing nothing, I think that's something that ASEAN countries really need to think about a little bit more, and to see where's that threshold and comfort level to really push things forward. You also mentioned things about continuity, which is very important. You've got 1 year to do it, let's push it through, but the next year somebody else may have a different plan. And I think that's a very real concern for ASEAN going forward. The restructuring, I think nobody would disagree with you institutionally. There are a lot of weak points that can be improved, as well as the ASEAN back itself. And I think very good point, enforcement. So once we have all these grand plans and it goes down to domestic implementation, but then who really monitors and enforces that as well? And that's basically the crux of how economic integration would work. So thank you for your thoughts on that. And I think moving on, I think when we think about economic integration, I think how we've heard from Tan Sri, we think about economic integration in very traditional forms of trade and investment activities. They are important, but just as important, or if not more important, is the foundation or the kind of infrastructure that is required to really facilitate trade and investment activities. One of these pillars, of course, is financial infrastructure. And in the current day's times, I think you cannot really move away too much from financial infrastructure without talking about the digital space as well. So I think with that, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Pei to present his thoughts on enhancing regional economic prosperity through digital financial innovation.
Thank you. Thank you, ISEAS, for your invitation to enroll to share on this very important topic. We think ASEAN actually stands at a pivotal movement in financial services transformation. Digital innovation is not just changing how we bank. It's expanding access, driving inclusion, and creating new economic opportunities. So my presentation will draw on some of the work that we have done, including a survey that we did among our member countries, which include the ASEAN Plus 3, namely China, Japan, and South Korea. So as you can see, firstly, let me touch on what drives financial digitization. Now, according to a survey that we did with member countries, the drivers came from a combination of demand and supply factors, as well as policy initiatives. Across the whole region, demand is the primary driver, but there are interesting differences between the ASEAN and Plus 3 economies. In ASEAN economies, consumers are demanding improved services, better user experience, more convenient access. Whereas in the Plus 3 economies, the focus is more on efficiency, faster transactions, lower costs, streamlined processes. This reflects the difference in maturity. The Plus 3 financial systems are already more digitized, so users are optimizing for efficiency rather than basic access. On the supply side, competition and innovation, led by fintechs and big techs, are also reshaping the landscape. Now, these new players are challenging traditional banks and forcing the entire industry to innovate. From a policy perspective, creating room for financial services and inclusion is critical, especially given the large unbanked populations in some of the ASEAN economies. So greater transparency and traceability of transactions are important, ranks somewhat lower, but remains on the regulator's radar. If you look at the region, it's very diverse. Now, what makes the region particularly fertile ground for digital revolution is a sizable unbanked population in some parts of ASEAN, particularly the Indo-Chinese countries, right? And this represents massive opportunities for digital financial inclusion. Look at Laos. In terms of the unbanked population, it's 62%, a lot higher than most of the other economies in the region. At the same time, we see impressive internet and mobile penetration. Notice the median age across the region, very young populations in their 20s and 30s who are digital natives. So the demographic dividend is powerful to accelerate digital revolution. Now, fintech revenue growth projections over the next 5 years. It is interesting to note that ASEAN Plus 3 is not just participating in the fintech revolution. We are, in fact, leading it. You look at the red bar, right? The projection over the next 5 years in terms of revenue growth is about 36%, 10% more than the global growth projection. And one of the most visible transformations is the rapid shift to cashless payments, and Asia is leading this global trend. In Asian e-commerce, digital wallets have become dominant. By 2030, it is projected that cash will be almost negligible in e-commerce. Even at physical point-of-sale locations where cash traditionally dominated, we are seeing a remarkable shift. Digital wallets are gaining significant ground alongside account-to-account transfers and other cashless methods. And payments are the bridgehead of financial innovation. Success here will create platforms for deeper financial services. How about bank technology investments? Now, banks, the traditional banks themselves recognize this shift, and they are responding with substantial investments. We are seeing steady increase in technology spending across most ASEAN Plus 3 economies. Now, this isn't discretionary spending, because bank recognizes that this is essential for their survival. But it is quite a tricky thing to invest in fintech and technology. When I was at UOB, I looked at strategic investments for the bank. And one of the issues that we are always trying to balance is what is strategic and what is for profitability. And what is strategic may not necessarily be profitable. And where do you draw the balance? Where do you strike that balance? Now, as banks invest in digital, they are also rationalizing physical infrastructure. Branches and ATMs, as you can see, are declining. Now, to be sure, this is happening globally, and the region is actually accelerating a lot faster. And the challenge, I think, will be to manage this transition equitably. I think banks and policymakers will need to ensure that they are not leaving their vulnerable populations behind. Now, this chart shows the ownership patterns, of these digital banks. Who owns them? Now, this transformation has given rise to a new category of financial institutions called digital banks. They are now the new frontier, right, in the banking landscape. And if you look at across the region, there's also a diverse ownership patterns of these regional banks. In some countries, like Korea and Malaysia, the tech and fintech companies dominate digital banks' ownership. In others, like Hong Kong and Indonesia, there's more balanced participation from traditional FIs alongside tech firms. Now, digital banks are also scaling rapidly. The growth in deposits and lending are quite impressive. And that shows that I think there's growing consumer trust and adoption. But to be sure, if you look at in terms of their composition, size of or share of their deposits and loans as a percentage of the total banking system, perhaps with the exception of Korea, right, the rest are still quite small. But I think the share will grow over time. Now, we asked in our survey, what is the key risk as banks continue to digitize? I think the key risk for most of the respondents is quite clear. Operation, cyber risk. That is the number one risk, right? And we did a study on the impact of cyber attacks on the stock markets. And based on our analysis, the impact actually ranged from negative 0.7% to 2.4%, of course, depending on the estimation window. Now, digital banks' NPL ratio on average are generally comparable to those of traditional banks, with ample provisioning among those who have started to report such data. Average NPLs for digital banks in Korea and Hong Kong are even lower than those of their traditional counterparts. However, credit risk warrants continued monitoring, as seen in the Philippines, where the initial higher NPLs reported by digital banks were due to nascent underwriting standards and the challenges of lending to underserved borrowers. Recent bank runs have also been larger and faster compared to the past episodes. Because of the always-on nature of digital banking systems, you can move funds a lot more faster. And this was evident in the Silicon Valley Bank crisis. It was about 2 years ago, where depositors can rapidly withdraw funds following rumors and concerns about the bank's financial health. In fact, in just one day, 25% of deposits were withdrawn. Now, in sum, digitization does not eliminate traditional banking risk. It transforms them. Credit risk manifests differently in digital banks, and liquidity risk is amplified by the speed of digital transactions. Let me conclude with this slide. I think going forward, there will probably be 3 major innovations that will be the next phase of digital finance in our region. And they are at very different stages of readiness. Firstly, on the digital payments front, across ASEAN, we are seeing QR code payment systems becoming interoperable. Singapore's PayNow can now connect with Thailand's PromptPay, Malaysia's Do It Now, and Indonesia's QRIS. And bilaterally, we are likely to see more of such connectivity. And more importantly, with the project Nessus, which is led by the BIS Innovation Hub, multiple countries, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, India, will be connected through one platform, but it will take a while before it became live in 2027. Now, on CBDC, central bank digital currencies, multiple ASEAN central banks are piloting through various initiatives. We have Singapore's Project Orchard, Thailand's Digital Art, Malaysia's Project Agama. And the centerpiece of the Project Orchard is purpose-bound money, a protocol that specifies conditions under which an underlying digital currency can be used. And this allows issuers to program restrictions on how and where the money can be spent. Looking at the medium term, we think stablecoins are going to transform cross-border payments. There's been quite a lot of publicity on stablecoins of late. Now, right now, migrant workers lose 6 to 8% of their remittances to fees and exchange rates. Now, with stablecoins, that drops to around 0.5%. And the speed difference is also dramatic. Traditional banking takes 3 to 5 business days. Stablecoins settle in minutes, operating 24/7. So it's crucial for families who need urgent support or businesses with time-sensitive payments. Finally, I think on the longer term, I think increasingly the real-world assets will be tokenized. And this is already happening in the US. Now, you think about commercial real estate, luxury goods, fine art assets that can be used to acquire millions to invest in. Tokenization basically breaks into affordable digital as shares. And you open wealth-building opportunities to many retail investors. Of course, it also comes with a lot of risk as well, right? And scams too. Yeah. But nevertheless, we think that with stablecoins, tokenization will probably be the next step. And that could be good for financial inclusion. But that also has a lot of implications for regulators. It will be increasingly difficult for regulators to make sure that much as they want to encourage financial inclusion, there must be proper guardrails for many of the vulnerable population. I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pei. It was a very informative presentation. I definitely learned a lot, genuinely. And I saw Tan Sri also, I think you've piqued some nostalgia in him because he was leaning forward and more forward during your presentation to look at your stats. And I heard Mr. Vrkić also said, when you said manage transition equitably. So I think there's something for everyone to take from your presentation. And just to end from your last slide about the innovation that we can look forward to becoming more developed in the future, I think there's always this conversation about the push and pull, or the tug of war, if you will, between pushing the boundaries of innovation and also having the safeguards or the guardrails that can protect stakeholders from too much innovation, I guess. And I think that's a balance that is definitely a conversation going forward in this space into the near future. Another area that is quite a buzz is, much like digitalization, is sustainability or the green transition. This is also another area where when we think about integrating a region or really pushing forth some initiatives together or some coordinated cooperation, it always seems to be stagnated or impeded by differences in policies, regulations, or even just the priorities for different countries. And again, financing is a key pillar of actually pushing through these sustainability initiatives. And with that, I'd like to invite Mr. Vrkić. May I invite you to provide your interventions on financing the green transition, a collective ASEAN responsibility. You have the floor.
Thank you. Here comes the UN. I promise, Marco, to behave, and you're all safe, I'm sure. I'd like to start by thanking the Institute for inviting us. It's a privilege and pleasure to be here, and to thank my two speakers beforehand. Raised a few things that I've been jotting down, I'm sure we can talk about later. So I'm here to talk about finance, sustainable finance, green finance, the just transition. I am the res rep for UNDP. Our job really is very much focused on human development. We're the biggest part of the UN system. We are the backbone of the development system, and certainly our mandate's a universal one, and that is really how I'll approach the presentation here. Just reflecting on this question of green transition, because it is very topical at the moment across ASEAN. It was featured very much in the lead up to ASEAN at leaders meeting. It was something that was touched on not just in the leaders meeting, but in the margins with other delegations, the plus countries, if you will. What we're witnessing today is an unprecedented paradigm shift. The speed at which it is changing the global landscape geopolitically, economically, socially, I think is unprecedented, and it's representing some deep structural changes at a time when there is a growing focus on growth. Very simply, this idea of the transition or the transformation is very much about decarbonising economies. And I think this is kind of where I'll start the discussion. So the whole idea of financing a green transition is about creating a new ecosystem, new global economic ecosystem that is not dependent on carbon. And I think one of the structural challenges we face in the global economy is that growth is intimately tied to carbon. So this idea of decarbonising is a very big question. It's not something that can be done overnight. It will take time to pivot. And when I say time, it's more than the next COP. We're looking at the next 20 or 30 years. What is very evident is international experience shows us that where we have pursued growth in a country, it's not been possible without access to energy, cheap and reliable energy. And this is a key ingredient for economic development. So this really strikes at the heart of some of the efforts that are being led globally, regionally, within ASEAN and bilaterally, about looking at power generation. I think energy is often misunderstood. It's treated as a monolithic resource. It's not. Energy is something that is provided for residential purposes, for industrial purposes. There are different sources and types. There's no one magic solution for energy. So the question then becomes, can we continue to grow, which is what is central to ASEAN's mandate, at a time when we really need to decarbonise? And the reason I say that is that ASEAN as a bloc is at the forefront of climate challenges. So you're in a region with various economies at various stages, with various demographics that cover urban, rural, remote, low-lying and atoll areas. Weather patterns are becoming growingly erratic, and large parts of that 600 million block rely on agriculture for food security, economic security, or a combination of the both. What we are seeing is a dramatic shift in weather patterns, and we talk about climate only about sea levels and temperature rise, but actually it's much more profound. It actually will disrupt the global economy. To give you two very relevant examples to ASEAN, dengue is being found in places and at a prevalence it's never been found before, and the malaria line has dropped from 1,400 metres to 800 metres in the space of 20 years. So whereas once you would not catch malaria below 14 or above 1,400 metres, now you're getting it above 800 metres. That's quite a significant drop. And if you think you're paying a lot for a coffee today, give it 10 years. Give it 10 years. Okay. The green one, right. Green for go, red for bad, right. So I thought I would, and apologies for the density of the text, but I thought I'd start with some metrics. The numbers are big, but the needs are great as well. And this is to give you a global perspective and to cast ASEAN within that global perspective. So if you look at the numbers there's about 11% of ASEAN's GDP could be impacted if we don't address mitigation adaptation. Now, as an old climate advisor, I would be remiss to suggest to you that we should be focused on mitigation. I think that ship sailed. The 1.5 target, as much as it hurts to say, we've missed that. We're on track for 3.2, 3.5, 3.8 within the next 20 to 30 years. That is quite cataclysmic. You will have seen overnight the pictures coming out of Jamaica and in the Bahamas about that there's a category 5. That is going to become more and more prevalent. So the cyclone seasons and the hurricane seasons, or the typhoon as we call them in this part of the world, are getting longer and the storms are more frequent and they're more intensive. In terms of mobilisation for financing for climate action, and this is both for mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation is the decarbonisation. Adaptation is where you start to build, move, do things to protect people and assets. It's about 115 billion was mobilised last year. The global economy at the moment is 110 trillion. It gives you an idea of where we're at. In 2024, we spent over 300 billion on AI development. In 2024, we spent almost 500 billion globally on creating new data centres. So that gives you an idea of it. Now, the irony with a data centre is that data centres are inherently environmental vandals with water and energy. So countries like Malaysia and Singapore, Malaysia in particular, that's looking at expanding data centres, when you've got more erratic weather patterns, it becomes a bit of a problem. So you start to look at this with a much more realistic view. At the moment for ASEAN, our estimate is we need about 200 billion annually until 2030 to start to hit the net zero targets. At the moment, ASEAN as a block is spending about 12% of that. That's what you're doing annually as a block. So a long way to go, there's a big fiscal gap. We know from our own modelling around the world that for every dollar we invest in climate-proofing infrastructure, which is critical to economic growth and development, we avoid up to $4 in losses. It is unfortunate of that 115 billion, only about 5% is flowing to adaptation. And I highlight that because of the vulnerability that ASEAN countries face. And if you overlay that with faltering economic growth, with conflict, with destabilisation, you start to see that when you scan the horizon, you have multi-dimensional challenges. Not all bad though. There are a few things, a few examples it would be remiss of me not to provide. To give you an idea, our modelling would suggest that if we would hit carbon neutrality by 2050, we'd see a very substantial increase in the GDP of ASEAN countries collectively. So there is an underlying economic argument for why transitioning towards more self-sustaining, greener, decarbonised investments make sense. We think based on this that we would create somewhere between 49 million and 66 million jobs in ASEAN by the middle of the century. So it opens up a range of opportunities. There is disruption and dislocation, and to pick up Tanchi's Game of Thrones observation, which I think is a great one actually, is that chaos can be a ladder. And I think in all of the chaos, there's an opportunity, and I think it is incumbent for ASEAN. ASEAN is well placed to lead on this, to make the opportunity. Just to give you a few examples of what my organisation is doing, we have set up green bonds. We're in the middle of working one in Malaysia at the moment. We did launch, we have capitalised to 10 billion, the green sukuk in Indonesia. In Thailand, we are working very closely with government on sustainability bonds. Cambodia and Nepal, there is a growing sense on climate, applying a climate lens in public finance and investment, but also as part of the regulatory work. And in Bangladesh, the gender bonds, which very much apply gender responsive. We find there are different demographics impacted by climate. There's a reality to this. Rural and remote communities, and within that, women and the elderly disabled. We tend to find that they are left behind. And there's a range of economic and cultural reasons for that. And we're working to address that. I should also declare that for my sins, I am the resident representative for the United Nations Capital Development Fund. That is the bit of the UN that can lend money. And more, traditionally we have de-risked. So we worked, for example, in Papua New Guinea with the Asian Development Bank to establish a revolving fund that brought down commercial interest rates for micro businesses from 36% to 8%. On loans of up to $50,000 to pursue climate, environmentally friendly businesses. So we do that. Growingly, that underwriting is looking at de-risking to risk capital. So growingly, we are looking at that as risk capital, and that's our discussions with the private sector, with asset managers and banks, particularly in Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia, is very much about investing in climate, in risk capital, if I will. It'll give you a sense there. There's work across the region, and it is this great question of blended finance, which seems to mean different things to different people, but essentially it's looking to leverage the best bits that we can to get a coherent product to end users. Okay, a couple of policy recommendations from us. So very much, I guess the three that we would look at when we apply them to ASEAN, this question around harmonisation, just to pick up from the previous speakers, the opportunity for ASEAN is to reduce barriers to entry and increase integration. The challenge in the ASEAN context, and I heard a reference to the European Union this morning, and the European Union is not a model I would necessarily advocate, but the great challenge is that ASEAN is founded on non-interference, whereas the EU is founded on integration. So inherently, there will be a bilateral element that tends to overtake a multilateral commitment. I think the opportunity, and Malaysia's done a fabulous job chairing this year, the opportunity is to pursue those opportunities for deeper integration. But not just within ASEAN, but using ASEAN's weight as a bloc to trade, particularly in the moment with the geopolitical situation that we've got. So for us, it's very much looking at policy harmonisation, legislative harmonisation, reducing barriers to entry, and having common regulation across that offers predictability for investment, because we know that public money is useful and it's important, but it doesn't hold the solution. It is actually a blend of financing instruments from various sources, particularly the private sector. On de-risking, very much looking at this question about understanding that there will be times where what we traditionally look at as risky needs to be done because the paradigm has shifted, and that requires that we look at redefining engagement, profitability, because some of these investments look risky on paper, but if we don't do them now, in 50 years' time, we'll be paying for it. The last thing I wanted to register was very much around the question around the social dimension of the transition and green financing. I think there is a real opportunity for a broader reset, and I think for the position of the UN and UNDP in particular is that this affords an opportunity to look at the social dimensions of profit-making, investment, opportunity, job creation, not necessarily to increase profit, but to grow wealth for a greater number of people, and ultimately to lift and improve the well-being of greater numbers of people. We should not forget that demographically within ASEAN, there's extreme poverty and extreme wealth. It would be nice to bring those two polars a little bit closer together, I think. That would be my sort of view on this. We have time for one more slide. We have time for one more slide. I'm allowed to, that's okay. Okay. So I'd be remiss by not looking at supply chains, because this is where we're seeing the greatest movement. This is something that we were involved with. It was an ASEAN Finance Ministers Initiative. We launched it in April this year. We work with the Central Bank, or Bank Negara in Malaysia. This is how we are applying this with the Malaysian government to look at greening value chains. There's a lot of work. We're moving into a second phase. We've delivered a proof of concept. But it's looking at, to put it into a Paris Agreement context, not just Article 6, but Article 3. So the question of emissions and seepage throughout the entire supply chain, and looking how you can increase value across an entire supply chain. And if I was to cite an organisation, a real example, if I look at L'Oreal, I was talking to their group manager here in Singapore 2 weeks ago. This is something they're very serious about. So companies are starting to look at this because the economics make sense. But really, just to give you a practical sense, because the UN, we do more than just talk, I think we do occasionally some stuff that's substantial. We're working at the moment on trying to deliver some draft regulation and model legislation which looks at the greening of value chain and what that means, and the cost that means for micro, small and medium business, because ultimately the greatest incentive we find is whether it's profitable. The question for us is, how do we harmonise green or greening investments with profitability? I thought I would just finish it there. I think that's bang on 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. You're right, it was bang on 15 minutes. So you had a little timer in your head as well. So I haven't had to score anyone so far on this panel. But thanks, Mr. Vrkić, for your insights on this. I think what I gather from your presentation is that we really have a lot to do in this space. We're really just only scratching the surface of what needs to be done, and there's a lot more to be done for actual mobilization of capital and financing. But from what I see from Mr. Pei's presentation, there is liquidity. It just needs to be able to funnel through, and I think you pointed out some good points: standardization, harmonization, and all those aspects, those fundamental aspects need to really come into play. But unfortunately, it is the most challenging, I think. But just to leave off by saying that I liked how you also included the social aspect of things, because I think when we look at all these, big mega trends and in the world, we seem to maybe disregard some of the human aspect in things, and that's very important because, of course, people, organizations, firms, and its stakeholders, they are really the central point of all this, right? So we can't really disregard that. I think I'd just like to check with my audio people whether the next slide deck is ready. Great. So I think just moving on to the last session of this panel, like when we think about how economic development actually happens, it's how do countries really jump to the next level of the value chain and really progress and develop as a nation? I think when we talk about this, innovation is very central to the discussion. And in fact, innovation can actually separate the leaders from the laggards. But when we talk about economic integration and what we've been talking about today, ASEAN as an economy and as a region, we'd want to have countries more or less at similar industrial capabilities rather than not. So innovation can separate, but it can also help to bridge the gaps between countries. So with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Kamiya to have the floor to present ASEAN's industrial policies and innovation for resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristina, and it's a great pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel. Thanks to the ASEAN Study Center and ISEAS team for putting all this together. Really is very interesting. I will try to build on what Director Choi said in the morning, as well as Minister Liu. But I want to share a story. I've been stationed in Jakarta for almost 2 years. So I arrived in December 2023. And I was invited to a meeting at ASEAN as an observer. And this meeting, it was taking too long. So it was supposed to be 1 hour, but it was taking a lot of negotiation. And then I said, oh, I have to leave, But one of the delegates told me, let me tell you a joke. You know why meetings take too long in ASEAN? Because 10 different countries with different coffee cultures has to decide by consensus at what time is the coffee break. Yeah? But actually, things are improved now. And now, 11 countries with Timor-Leste. Yeah? Yeah. I will start by referring to the flying geese model, then discuss manufacturing and resilience, and emphasize the role of 3 specific things that ASEAN can start implementing in order to advance on industrial policies, and finally, provide reflection on the importance of ASEAN in promoting regional productive development. As my Mr. Kian, Mr. Nazir, Mr. Edwards, so they have explained on the finance. I think the future, the relevance of ASEAN will be measured by the capacity to agree on financial arrangements in the region, as well as to integrate an industrial policy, which is actually very difficult, but is necessary. And this is not just preparing coffee. And this is not just ASEAN, so let me share with you that this is also an internal debate in the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C., in the African Union that has been relatively successful in putting together a number of policies, but Mercosur also. So they are all facing these difficult challenges. But again, important thing is to agree and find the ways to design mechanisms on finance and on industrial policies. So the flying geese model, so this initially was introduced by the Japanese economist Akamatsu in the last century, has long explained how industrialization spread from advanced to less developed economies in East and Southeast Asia. Actually, in the 80s, this model inspired a famous book published by the World Bank, the East Asian Miracle. And traditionally, so Japan was the lead goose, followed by newly industrializing economies, so South Korea, Hong Kong, Chinese Taipei, and Singapore. And then ASEAN 4, so Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Thailand, and eventually China. Today, however, China has fundamentally redefined this model. So no longer is a follower. China has become a little economy in its own right, accounting for nearly 29% of global manufacturing output. And this transformation brings, of course, new dynamics. So China ascending in the value chain, so moving into high technology manufacturing, electric vehicles, and advanced semiconductors. That means the labor-intensive and medium technology production is starting to relocate to ASEAN. So from 2017 to 2023, Chinese outbound SDI into ASEAN manufacturing jumped from 12.5 billion to 37.3 billion US dollars. So ASEAN's role in this new flying geese pattern is no longer a passive recession of industries. Instead, what we see is a multi-level flying geese at various levels. So you have Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia simultaneously receiving relocated manufacturing while upgrading or trying to upgrade their own industrial capabilities. So the key insights from UNIDO's upcoming 2026 flagship industrial development report shows that this pattern offers ASEAN the chance not just to absorb displaced production, but to position itself strategically within global value chain. Some of the requirements to do this I will explain at the end of this presentation. But what about investment, manufacturing, and resilience, which is a topic that Minister Liu alluded in the morning? So manufacturing now makes up almost 15% to 25% of GDP in major ASEAN economies. So with key sectors that includes electronics, automotive parts, textile, agricultural processing. So for regions, integration into global value chain this is a key driver of growth, with over 60% of ASEAN export tied to these networks. However, this integration also makes the region vulnerable to external shocks. As we know, we have discussed in other panels, pandemic, geopolitical fragmentation, climate disruption, and changing trade policies. And according to ASEAN Investment Report 2025, SDI in 2024 increased by 8% to 226 billion. So this is despite 11% decline in global flows. So that means that international investors, the ambassador also mentioned this, view the region as a safer, more diversified alternative to concentrate supply chains. But another interesting trend in that most ASEAN countries are increasingly aligning with China rather than with the United States. And this is independently of whether they like it or not. So it was mentioned also before an index. This is the anatomy of choice alignment, OCAI, by the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And actually, this index was featured in The Economist magazine last week. Moreover, a study on Southeast Asia by Cambridge University Institute for Manufacturing and UNIDO shows that stronger manufacturing increases supply chain resilience and helps generate better jobs and sustain growth. So ASEAN's manufacturing resilience is about building adaptive production systems that can pivot rapidly to new opportunities. So countries like Vietnam, Singapore, and Malaysia has demonstrated this by rapidly scaling semiconductor assembly and attracting high-tech investment previously concentrated in China. So expanding manufacturing depends on having ASEAN-level industrial policy. So this is key and this is essential. So we believe there is significant potential in enabling member states to pool resources, share knowledge, and leverage sectoral complementarities in minerals, manufacturing, and renewable energy. Such coordination can help smaller countries access opportunities that would be out of reach alone. However, there are challenges, as you know. Asia's flexible consensus-driven approach, known as the ASEAN Way, promotes inclusiveness and sovereignty. But this often leads to slow progress and implementation. And also, this limited integration prevents members from fully developing productive complementarities. So additionally, most members continue to depend on foreign direct investment strategies. So let me propose 3 initiatives to advance on a regional industrial policy setting. So the first is to focus on something that already ASEAN member states are doing relatively well, that is the eco-industrial parks. And industrial parks are central to ASEAN industrialization strategy. So they concentrate infrastructure, attract FDI, facilitate technology transfer, and generate employment. So UNIDO, together with the World Bank and the GIZ, has championed the transition to eco-industrial parks. So in several countries, governments are designing legal frameworks based on UNIDO eco-industrial parks. So that's something that is an important precedent. But the second to support industrial policy setting is to work on standards for trade. And ASEAN has achieved remarkable success in reducing tariff barriers. So nobody can deny that. So nearly 99% of intra-ASEAN trade is now tariff-free. Yet this progress is undermined by persistent non-tariff barriers, divergent product standards, complex conformity assessment, and difficult, cumbersome custom processes. So standard harmonization is not a technical detail, it's a strategic imperative. So there is the ASEAN Consultative Committee for Standards and Quality that was established in 1992 and has been working to harmonize national standards with international standards across electronics, automotive, food products, pharmaceuticals, textile, and building materials. So standards and certifications must be accelerated at the ASEAN level to integrate trade with productive capacities. But the number three, the third can be for industrial policy setting is the design of a regional financial facility for clean industrial upgrade. So UNDP in Paris working in that, but Mr. Nazir also referred to this. And this facility can be structured to mobilize capital and technical expertise for green industrial transformation across ASEAN or similar regions. So this facility can be modeled on existing initiatives like ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility and the European Union Innovation Fund. So the structure may be set as a trust fund or a special purpose vehicle jointly owned by regional governments. So multilateral development banks can also be part of this, AIIB, ADB, or the World Bank, and key private stakeholders. So this can have a governing board also with representation from each member state to ensure alignment with both national and regional priorities. So let me, to finish last slide, so back to the new flying geese model. So in the short term, policies in Southeast Asia and in the Asia-Pacific will depend on tariff and transshipment fees. So we don't know still the impact of transshipment, but an integrated approach is needed. If an ASEAN-level position is refined, that will be even better. But in the medium term, a new flying geese model, maybe Chinese, maybe American-led, maybe European-led, is needed in Southeast Asia, as well as in other developing countries. To do this, three external conditions are needed. First, investment in infrastructure, a consumption market provided by the US, potentially by Europe, and eventually by China, and progressive transfer of industries from China and other countries to Southeast Asia. But also, three internal ASEAN conditions are essential. The ASEAN has to strengthen the absorption capacity of technology. So there is a transfer, but there is no capacity to absorb, then nothing will happen. Managerial skills and worker technical skill must be increased, and this has to be a joint effort. And national corporation and formal SMEs has to be enhanced to scale up industrial development. So in some countries, even 30–40% of SMEs are informal. And there is no story, there is not example of a company that coming out from informal sector has been able to become a unicorn. So it's important to address this issue. So from UNIDO's perspective, the pathway is to recalibrate industrial policies, enhancing people and companies' skills to expand technological absorption capabilities, and for this, use eco-industrial parks, advance on standards and certifications, and design finance facility for green industrial policies to strengthen ASEAN productive capabilities. So technological disruption and geopolitical realignment must be invitations to reimagine ASEAN's industrial future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kamiya, for your insights. I see a lot of similarities with Mr. Vrkić as well, especially on the green element, and especially on the need for standardization and harmonization. Again, very difficult to do in practice. I think what Tan Sri mentioned, the enforcement of it as well. I think from my observation, I think it starts off with even the definition of green. I think a lot of governments don't even agree on what the definition of green is, and also with that political will to actually push forward a lot of the initiatives that you mentioned. And I just, maybe a cheeky side note, that I think the new flying geese model is definitely one that can be considered for the regional industrial model, but I'm just thinking about the current geopolitical context and whether it will actually stoke the flame rather than save it, you know. But I mean, I'd like to open up the floor for any questions. I think we've had a very rich discussion so far, many different types of topics, so I'm sure we have quite a few questions. I think maybe if you can make your way to the microphone or raise your hand, that would be very helpful. Yeah, please. Maybe we'll take one from this side first, this gentleman, and then yourself, sir. Yes, you can stay there though. Okay, never mind, you can rest for a while. Okay, so maybe we'll take a couple of questions for the first round. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Kesava from NUS. I just have a very pessimistic doubt after all the optimism. Statistics show that from the 2010s decade to the 2020s decade projected, ASEAN's annual GDP growth has fallen by 2 percentage points. That's massive. And Goldman Sachs predicts that going into the 2030s, 2040s onwards, ASEAN is only going to keep slowly dipping. It's not going to go up. For a comparison, sub-Saharan Africa has grown faster than ASEAN in the 2020s. Goldman Sachs predicts, again, that by 2050, the African continent, which would have a greater population, its GDP would equal that of ASEAN and then overtake. A comparison closer to home, ever since IMF has put out its GDP stats, ASEAN has always edged India out. India has overtaken ASEAN about a year or two ago. By 2050, India's GDP is predicted to be nearly twice that of ASEAN. ASEAN's influence or importance in the world is heavily predicated on its ability to deliver economic growth. And these statistics show that ASEAN's influence may actually dip. So I think my question is this fated? Is the new geese model perhaps a savior, or can anything else be done? Thank you.
Sorry, before I hand it to the other person, can you please state your name and your affiliation?
Kesava, a research fellow at the Asia Research Institute in
Okay,
US.
thank you, thank you. I think maybe we can answer that question first. Okay, it's who wants to take it on? Maybe I should ask the panel, because it's a quite a multifaceted kind of question, and something that we didn't really touch on specifically because we talked more about structural factors. Okay, maybe because flying geese was mentioned, and from a structural perspective in terms of how ASEAN can really, prove its resilience amongst Goldman Sachs's forecasts. Maybe Dr. Kamiya, I may invite you first for some comments.
Well, somebody told me when I was young that the difficult thing can be done immediately, the impossible takes more time. And I think this has to be the spirit of what we expect of ASEAN, because we cannot foresee in the mid-80s if China would grow. So that's something that happened, and even in the 2000s. So it was difficult to predict in the next 10 years or 20 years about growth. So that means this shouldn't be deterministic. I think if ASEAN countries start working together, And with all these frictions and new environment, they may be really an opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's important to not take it as an as is. I mean, things can change. I mean, in terms of growth rates, yeah, I mean, okay, never mind. I won't add anymore. I'm the moderator, right? So I think we had a gentleman in the middle. We'd like to take your question, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Robert Fox, Eurocham, Thailand. I'd like to address this question to Tan Sri. Many of us, Tan Sri, have followed your career with great admiration, the way CIMB had become a regional ASEAN company. It's very interesting that there are probably two genuine ASEAN groups, AirAsia and CIMB, and they're both Malaysian. Years ago, Tony Fernandez proposed a single aviation market, and almost none of those proposals have come to fruition. And we still have a very complicated system for aviation in the region. I want to look at some of your comments. The Straits Times had a front page story following high-level meetings in Malaysia recently about the Digital Economy Framework Agreement. So our regional business organization immediately got into trying to understand this great milestone where it was about to be closed and, quote, substantially finished. To our surprise and disappointment, we found that there are many very fundamental issues that are not agreed. For example, data localization, cross-border data flows, and a number of other things. Your comments about the way ASEAN functions, etc., need to be really well appreciated by all, I think. But I'm wondering, what would you see as incentives using the DIFA, the current state of DIFA, what would you see as incentives to ASEAN member states to close it? Because it seems to be going in fragmented directions still. Thank you.
I mean, I don't know the specific outstanding issues. I mean, DEFA was meant to be, DEFA was a priority for Malaysia's chairmanship. It should have been signed. And what happened was they announced substantially completed, which is a polite way of saying not completed. Yeah. Almost there means didn't get there. There are clearly, there were, to be honest, at the beginning, it's going to be legally binding. And I always thought that that's groundbreaking. So you got to be glass half full that, we're making an attempt at a legally binding agreement. So it's always going to be very, very tough. But from what was said at the ASEAN Business and Investment Summit, it seems that they do think that the final obstacles can be overcome. I can't really say specifically, I'm afraid, because I just do not know the details of the kind of last mile of DEFA.
Can I get another round of questions? Yeah, the gentleman there, please. And if anybody else can just come up to the mics, and I'll be able to see you from the periphery. Yeah.
Okay, my name is Yongguk Ryu from Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So in this panel, the panelists focused mainly on how and what ASEAN can do to generate more economic growth. So whether it's financial digitization or green economy and so on and so forth. I want to ask all the panelists what you see to be the major domestic, social, and political and economic challenges for generating ASEAN countries' future economic growth. Because sometimes it's not just the external challenges, it's really the domestic constraints that prevent growth for these countries. Thank you.
If there are no other questions at the moment, maybe if I can invite Mr. Pei, if you're ready with some remarks, and we'll go this way, down the line. Yeah, very challenging question though. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that I think the regional economies have different challenges, obviously, because each of the economy has a different stage of development. But one issue I think would policymakers have to confront with, I think, is how do they deploy whatever resources they have, right, on the fiscal side of things. Because the expenditure, the spending that you need to deploy, all the various projects that you need to execute, those are very challenging, right? So on the fiscal policy, I think we do see increasing pressure of what we call fiscal dominance on a number of the economies. And I think it is important also for central bank to remain independent, notwithstanding the pressure coming from the fiscal dominance, given the needs domestically to develop, be it on infrastructure or just to level up the development. And I think that will be an important challenge domestically, let alone, of course, to think about how to connect from one economy to another economy. Yeah, thank you.
And I think, every country has its own challenges, and we won't go into that. I think so far as ASEAN is concerned, I think what is needed is essentially there needs to be an effort to gain buy-in. I mean, so far the idea of regional integration is kind of probably very T20. Anything beyond that, there really isn't buy-in, and there's not enough effort to create that buy-in. ASEAN must mean more for its people. And similarly, in order for ASEAN to move forwards, we need our leaders to have the political capital to execute, which is why I'm worried for the next few years. You know, at the beginning of the year, we were kind of more optimistic because we saw this camaraderie between Lawrence Wong, Anwar, Prabowo, Marcos, and the former Thai Prime Minister, who I can't remember the name. And she didn't last very long. And you know, down forwards 9 months, the whole political scene has changed. So I'm a little bit worried about the momentum, particularly into next year. I do hope that President Marcos is, not too distracted by the political, domestic political situation, because ASEAN needs, as I said, if you want to implement, sometimes when you integrate, there's always some losers and some winners, some short-term and long-term. And, you need that political capital to say, look, in the interest of ASEAN, there are winners and there's losers. It's, plus and minuses. You've got to implement some of these things. And it may be a little not so good for certain sectors, but good for other sectors. So you must have the political capital, the trust of the population, and the buy-in to the whole idea of regionalism from the population. And I think not enough effort. They go to these ASEAN meetings and then they go home and they don't really talk about ASEAN anymore.
It's my turn. Okay. It's a great question. Look, I think there's a few things. Clearly, the geopolitics. I think at the moment there is, for every little bit of opportunity, there's a bit of risk, and they seem to cancel each other out, which will create an inertia, I suspect. Look, a couple of observations. What's not been spoken about is the demographic shift in the region, and it is people are living longer and they're healthier. And the big question for all governments is, what do we do about keeping people in the economy for longer periods of time? Because people are living well beyond 60, 65, 70 these days. It's really important because of the proportional impact it has on public revenues and public assistance. The second point I'd make is that this is all coming at a time of extraordinary technological upheaval. It's unprecedented. So not just AI, but robotics. So as the human population is slowing and aging, we're having a rise in technologies we've never seen before. That raises with it some very short-term dislocation, but some very long-term questions about the structural nature of economies and societies. Just to finish off on, I think there's another question, just to sort of pick up on previous two speakers. The fundamental nature of sovereignty is being questioned. It's changing. Yeah, there are corporations now that are larger than governments. So Apple's liquidity is 1 trillion or just over. The GDP of Papua New Guinea is 28 billion. So government of Papua New Guinea is bound by institutions and democratic voters, is Malaysia or Singapore, whatever the case may be, but Apple is not. or X or whoever it might be. So that has done a few things. It's really changed, I think, the role. It's put states under pressures that they've not envisaged previously, and they're not very well geared up to handle, actually. But it's also resulted in the erosion of public interest and public dialogue. And I think with that is the growth in apathy. And just to pick up on Tan Chiri's point, that for me is the big problem, is that the citizens of ASEAN are not as engaged in politics as they may have been 20 or 30 years ago. And this is a question then about transparency, accountability, and the quality of debate, policy, and public investment.
Yeah, I think this is a very important question. So I will say, just listing, I think it's important to develop financial markets. So this is one of the major national constraints. The second is the fiscal space that is limited. So government has to decide whether they finance social programs or productive capacities. Productive capacities are usually not urgent. No? It's for the long term, but it's necessary. Managerial capabilities and skills, blue-collar workers' skills is also absolutely necessary, because at some point, even by inertia, industries are going to come down to Southeast Asia, and companies, SMEs, large corporations has to be prepared to receive them. So if they don't have the skill, just the investment will go somewhere else. So I think these are domestic constraints, but also regional constraints, and this is part of the agenda for ASEAN in the future.
Okay, I think that was a great question, because we got views from across the table here. I heard a lot of fiscal space that is required, monetary policy certainty, and central bank independence. I think anything you need to get a good sovereign rating. And also about the, ASEAN needs to be, in the agenda of people, and people need to have that buy-in and, the belief in ASEAN, and also the political capital and will to push it through is very important. And of course, sovereignty and geopolitics is also a key aspect that may actually impede some of the growth momentum in ASEAN going forward. So I think this has been a very rich discussion. I'd like to close, but before that, and before thanking our speakers, I think Tan Sri would like a final word on the panel, if he may. Yep.
Sorry, I'm not that demanding. I just wanted to say one more thing about ASEAN, which is this: 2027. 2027, Singapore will chair ASEAN. No pressure, Rachel. Singapore will chair ASEAN. And I think Singapore, with its resources and intellectual capacity and credibility and so on, will be able, I think, to actually create big leaps for ASEAN. Yeah, and I really hope that Singapore does that. I think, I have some frustrations with Singapore's engagement with ASEAN economic integration. And I really hope that with your leadership in 2027, you drop this, you really spearhead integration of the region. There's ASEAN, I prepared for my ASEAN Chairmanship 18 months in advance. So, Rachel, you should, leave your firm now and start working full-time on preparing for 2027, because, there's so much potential with ASEAN. I love the idea of the regional organization. I really hope Singapore does a great job. Good luck. Thank you.
Thank you, Tan Sri. Well said. With that, please join me in thanking our panel today.